Daniel, the only son of the wealthiest man in the city, was quiet, arrogant, and spoilt. He grew up with his parents and two elder sisters who made life a living hell for him. At 18, Daniel was already running the company alongside his father Mr. Whitmore. It was quite exhausting for Daniel, especially for the fact that he often had to leave classes earlier than usual to meet up with his own official duties. It didn't take long for the whole school to know that he was from a wealthy background. If there was one thing Daniel hated, it was being teased by his sisters. Kate and Jane were loud, nosy, and utterly exhausting. Ever since they were kids, they treated him like their personal little doll. They would often make his hair a mess, pinching his cheeks and laughing at his reactions. Even now at 22, with a degree almost in hand, they still acted like he was a child. "Danny, you're so stiff. Smile a little," Kate would say, grabbing his face and squishing his cheeks together. "Maybe he's like this because he doesn't have a girlfriend," Jane would add, smirking. "Or maybe he does and he's hiding her from us." It didn't matter how many times Daniel ignored them, but they never stopped. One time they even changed his phone's ringtone to a ridiculous baby song. He nearly died of embarrassment when it rang during a business meeting. Kate and Jane had their own lives, their own careers, but whenever they had the time, they made sure to use it to make Daniel's life a living hell. And Daniel absolutely hated it. But despite all his frustration, he couldn't do anything about it. Welcome to Love Diary 101. Subscribe to follow all our latest stories. The story continues. Daniel had always been aware of the dangers that came with being the only son of a billionaire. He always thought he was safe on his own, but that changed when a business deal went wrong. His father, Mr. Whitmore, had unknowingly partnered with the legal investors. Going home, he often notices some bad guys glancing at him maliciously for the past 3 days. He had no choice but to tell his father about it. "Change schools," Mr. Whitmore said, pacing his study in frustration. "Finish your degree elsewhere. It's not safe here anymore." Daniel refused. He had only a month left before graduation. Running away wasn't an option. "I'm not a child," he told his father. "I will stay. But I need a bodyguard." His father tried to oppose the idea. "Don't worry, Dad. I'll pick him myself." And that was how the audition began. The estate's gym was filled with men in black suits, their gazes sharp with bodies built for combat. Some were ex-military officers, others are former agents, all handpicked by Mr. Whitmore's security team. Daniel, dressed in his usual dark turtleneck and tailored pants, stood at the front of the room with his arms crossed. He had no interest in a faceless shadow who would merely follow orders. If someone was going to be glued to his side, he needed to be worth it. One by one, the bodyguards showcased their skills: hand-to-hand combat, endurance tests, and tactical awareness. Some were too stiff, others too aggressive. Daniel observed in silence, unimpressed. Then the last candidate stepped forward. He had an air of effortless confidence. His black shirt fit snugly over his toned frame, and a teasing smirk played on his lips. Unlike the others, he wasn't stiff or overly formal. His sharp, mischievous eyes locked onto Daniel's. "My name is Kelvin Carter," he introduced himself. "Former special ops. Excellent at combat weapons and making rich guys like you flustered." A chuckle rippled through the room, but Daniel's expression remained unreadable. Kelvin's smirk widened. "Well," Kelvin prompted. "Aren't you gonna test me, boss?" Daniel didn't reply right away. But for the first time that day, he wasn't bored. "Show me what you've got," he finally said. And just like that, the real test began. Kelvin gave an eye-dropping performance which made him perfect for the job. Silence hung in the air as Daniel took a slow step forward, his sharp gaze fixed on Kelvin. Unlike the other candidates, Kelvin was outstanding. His smirk deepened as if amused by Daniel's attention. Daniel stopped just a foot away, his hands still tucked into his pockets. "Stand straight," Daniel instructed coolly. Kelvin didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head. "Do you want a soldier or a bodyguard?" Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He reached out, pulling Kelvin's shirt near his shoulder. Kelvin raised a brow. "Do you like what you see?" Daniel's jaw tightened and he cleared his throat. He dropped his hand and started walking away without another word. The other bodyguards exchanged glances, waiting for his decision. Mr. Whitmore, observing from a distance, glanced at his son expectantly. Daniel exhaled, barely glancing back as he spoke. "You're hired," he said, pointing at Kelvin. A few murmurs rippled through the room. Kelvin let out a low chuckle, rolling his shoulders before stuffing his hands in his pockets. "Well, this is gonna be fun." Daniel didn't respond. But as he stepped out of the gym, he could feel Kelvin's gaze burning into his back. "Nice choice," Mr. Whitmore said with a chuckle. He then told his guards to hand over the acceptance form to Kelvin to sign. "Why so many rules?" Kelvin asked, but then he saw the amount of money he was going to get paid in a month. It was a whopping $20,000. He was also going to have his own personal space at Daniel's home where he would stay to protect him at night. It was a good offer. Kelvin then hugged the bodyguard in excitement and went home to resume the following day. Kelvin arrived at the Whitmore estate the next day at 7 a.m., dressed in a crisp black shirt that clung to his toned frame, paired with fitted dark jeans and a leather jacket slung casually over his shoulder. The household staff barely acknowledged him. They had already been informed about the new bodyguard. Daniel, however, was still asleep. With a lazy smirk, Kelvin walked past the grand hallways, up the stairs, and straight into Daniel's room without knocking. He moved soundlessly across the polished floor, stopping beside the large king-sized bed where Daniel was sleeping. Kelvin leaned down, his lips near Daniel's ear. "Good morning, boss." Daniel's eyes snapped open immediately. His brows furrowed as he turned, still half-dazed from sleep. The moment he saw Kelvin hovering over him, he jolted upright, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. "What the hell are you doing?" he asked. Kelvin straightened up, crossing his arms. "I thought you had a class this morning." Daniel blinked, running a hand through his tousled hair. He did have a class, but that wasn't the point. He sighed, rubbing his temple, about to scold Kelvin for waking him up when he finally noticed him properly. The morning light from the window cast a soft glow on Kelvin's chiseled features. His sharp jawline, the slight smirk tugging at his lips, and his annoyingly perfect hair. For a brief moment, Daniel just stared at him. His mind went blank. He forgot what he wanted to say. Kelvin arched a brow. "Boss, are you okay?" Daniel snapped out of it, clearing his throat. "Next time knock before coming into my room." Kelvin chuckled and said, "All right, boss." He then went down to the sitting room where Daniel later came in already prepared for school. He then asked Kelvin to join him for breakfast. Daniel regretted not driving himself the moment they stepped onto campus. Kelvin, walking beside him with a casual yet commanding presence, drew every eye in sight. Girls whispered and giggled as they passed. Some slowed their steps, hoping to get a better look, while others just openly stared. "Who is that?" a girl murmured. "Is he a new lecturer?" "No way, he doesn't seem like one." Daniel ignored all of it and kept walking, his expression unreadable. Kelvin, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered. When Daniel finally sat in class, he couldn't help himself. His gaze flickered toward the window where Kelvin stood outside, leaning against the black SUV. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, his expression relaxed as if he had all the time in the world. Daniel found himself staring a little too long. "Dude, you keep looking outside." Daniel turned his head as his friend, Adrian, smirked at him. Adrian nudged him playfully. "Your bodyguard looks so hot, man. Bet he already has girls lining up for him." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to his notes, determined to ignore the sudden annoying warmth creeping up his neck. The moment Daniel's last lecture ended, he hurried out of the building, relieved to finally be done for the day. As expected, Kelvin was already waiting by the car, looking effortlessly cool as usual. Without a word, Kelvin opened the door for him and Daniel slid in. Once Kelvin got into the driver's seat, the car smoothly pulled away from the university gates. Daniel leaned back against the seat, massaging his temple. "You had a long day?" Kelvin asked, stealing a glance at him through the rearview mirror. Daniel didn't respond immediately. His mind was still on what Adrian had said earlier. "Your bodyguard looks so hot, man. Bet he already has girls lining up for him." Daniel exhaled sharply and closed his eyes. It wasn't his problem. When they arrived at the Whitmore mansion, Daniel stepped out first, already anticipating some peace and quiet. But the moment he walked through the entrance he realized he was wrong. Kate and Jane were already in the living room chatting over drinks when their eyes landed on Kelvin. "Baby brother is back," Jane, who had been sipping her cocktail, said. Kate leaned forward, raising an eyebrow. "Where have you been hiding this one?" Daniel sighed. "Here we go again." Kelvin, always the charmer, gave them a polite nod. "Nice to meet you both, ma'am." Jane practically blushed. "Daniel, why didn't you tell us you hired someone this handsome?" Kate teased. "If we had known, we would have visited more often." Daniel rolled his eyes. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Besides, he just resumed today." Jane, however, was already scheming something. She stood up and walked toward Daniel with a sly smile on her lips. "Hey baby brother." She walked towards Daniel as if to tell a secret. "So, I have this little problem. My ex is going to this event next week and I just know he'll be there with his new girlfriend. I can't let him think I'm still single and heartbroken, right?" Daniel's expression darkened. He already didn't like where this was going. Jane beamed. "So, lend me your bodyguard for a night. He can pose as my boyfriend." Kelvin chuckled under his breath, but Daniel's expression turned icy. "Don't even think about it." "Oh come on," she whined. "Kelvin, you wouldn't mind helping me out, would you?" She turned to him, batting her eyelashes. Kelvin only smiled, clearly enjoying the drama unfolding before him. But before he could answer, Daniel stepped in front of him. "Leave my bodyguard alone and find someone else." Jane raised an eyebrow. "Geez. You're being so protective already." Kate, watching from the couch, laughed at the whole scenario. Daniel shot them both a glare. "You two are so annoying." Jane sighed dramatically and turned back to Kelvin. "If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." Kelvin gave her a lazy smirk. "All right, ma'am." Daniel clenched his jaw. For some annoying reason, that one word from Kelvin irritated him more than it should. He hated how easily Kelvin entertained his sister's nonsense. "Kelvin," Daniel said sharply. "Come with me." Kelvin raised a brow but followed him out of the living room, leaving Kate and Jane to exchange knowing glances. As soon as they were alone, Daniel turned to Kelvin, his tone firm. "From now on, ignore my sisters, especially Jane." Kelvin tilted his head, amused. "Why? Are you jealous?" Daniel stiffened. His heart did a weird little skip and he hated it. "You're my bodyguard. You're not here to play pretend boyfriend for my sister." Kelvin chuckled, crossing his arms. "Relax, boss. I wasn't planning on saying yes." Daniel felt a strange sense of relief, but he quickly pushed it down. "Better," he muttered before storming off toward his room. The next morning, Daniel stepped into Whitmore Enterprises, heading straight to his father's office. His face was set in a deep frown. Kelvin, as usual, trailed behind him with his hands in his pockets, a lazy smirk playing on his lips. He had no idea what was coming. Getting to the entrance of his father's office, he then told Kelvin to wait for him outside. The moment Daniel entered the office, he didn't even sit down before saying, "Dad, please fire him. I don't want him to be my bodyguard anymore." Mr. Whitmore, who had been going through some documents, paused midway. He slowly looked up at his son, eyes narrowing in surprise. "Fire him?" he repeated. "What happened? I thought you handpicked him yourself." Daniel clenched his fists. "He's just too easy." Mr. Whitmore raised a brow. Daniel exhaled sharply. "People always find a way to make him the main topic at every point, and it's annoying." Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "What really happened?" Daniel scowled, hands stuffed into his pockets as he paced the office. "Kate and Jane met him last night. And guess what?" he scoffed. "Jane already wants him to pretend to be her boyfriend just to make her ex jealous." Before Daniel realized what was happening, Mr. Whitmore had burst into laughter. Daniel's scowl deepened. "Dad, what's so funny?" His father wiped the corner of his eye, shaking his head. "You son. You have no idea what you're doing." Daniel frowned. "What does that even mean?" Mr. Whitmore leaned forward, amusement still in his eyes. "If I were you, I'd keep that bodyguard." Daniel folded his arms. "Give me your reasons." His father smirked. Because the moment you fire him, Jane will definitely make him her bodyguard. And she'll pay him more than you ever did. Daniel froze. The realization hit him like a brick. He hadn't even considered the consequences of his actions. Jane would snatch him up immediately, and knowing her, she'd make sure to rub it in his face every chance she got. The thought of it alone made his stomach twist in frustration. Daniel gritted his teeth and looked away. Fine then, he muttered. Mr. Whitmore chuckled. That's what I thought. Without another word, Daniel turned on his heel and marched out of the office. Kelvin, who had been standing outside, tilted his head curiously as Daniel brushed past him without a word. Boss. What's the problem? Daniel didn't answer. He just kept walking. Kelvin knew something didn't sit right. He wondered what could have made Daniel to be so pissed and frustrated. Daniel finally reached his own office, shutting the door behind him. He threw himself into his chair and ran a frustrated hand through his hair. He had a full day of work ahead, but his mind refused to focus. Because no matter how hard he tried, one thought kept circling back to Kelvin. Why did people always have to talk about him? And why did Jane, of all people, have to take an interest in him? Daniel tapped his pen against the desk, restless. He hated how much space Kelvin was taking up in his thoughts. And worst of all, he didn't know why. Kelvin had barely settled in after escorting Daniel to his office when he got a message. Come to my office. It was from Mr. Whitmore. Kelvin raised a brow, shoved his phone into his pocket and strolled toward the CEO's office. When he walked in, Mr. Whitmore was leaning back in his chair, arms crossed as he studied him. Have a seat, Kelvin. Kelvin obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him. He wasn't nervous, just curious. Did I do something wrong, sir? Mr. Whitmore let out a breath. Not exactly. But I have a piece of advice for you. He steepled his fingers. Be a better bodyguard. Kelvin smirked. I thought I was doing a fantastic job. You are. Mr. Whitmore admitted. But Daniel almost fired you today. Kelvin blinked. But why, sir? Mr. Whitmore leaned forward. Listen, I don't want to replace you. You are the best candidate and frankly I like your style. He sighed. But Daniel is stubborn. If you keep making him uncomfortable you might not have this job for long. Kelvin tilted his head, smiling. I'll keep that in mind, sir. With that he got up and left the office. Later that day he made his way to Daniel's room. Kelvin pushed the door open without knocking. Daniel, who had been sitting at his desk, looked up with a glare. I told you to knock before coming into my room. Kelvin ignored him, shoving his hands in his pockets. I heard you wanted to fire me. Kelvin said. Daniel tensed slightly but scoffed. It's none of your business. Kelvin took a slow step forward, eyes locked on Daniel. Oh really? His voice dropped a little. Daniel clicked his tongue, looking away. You're causing trouble. Kelvin's brow lifted. What trouble? Daniel exhaled sharply. You're too friendly with everyone. My sisters. My friends. Even people at school. His jaw clenched. You're supposed to be my bodyguard, not some celebrity everyone gushes over. Kelvin's lips curved into a lazy smirk. He took another step closer. Then another. Until he was standing right in front of Daniel. His voice dropped to a whisper. So, do you want me to talk to you only? Daniel's breath hitched. Kelvin leaned in, his face too close. His scent, his warmth, everything was overwhelming. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. This was dangerous. Kelvin tilted his head slightly, his voice smooth. Is that it, boss? Daniel clenched his fists under the table. Step back, Kelvin. Kelvin didn't move. If anything, he leaned in closer. Are you sure? Daniel could feel his breath against his skin. For a second he forgot how to breathe. His heart was beating so fast. And Kelvin knew it. You have feelings for me, don't you? Kelvin asked, but Daniel looked away. The way Kelvin leaned in made his heart to beat faster. I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel said in denial. Kelvin hummed, unconvinced. He sat beside Daniel on the bed, their shoulders barely touching. You don't have to say anything. Kelvin said, his voice quieter now. Daniel turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Kelvin's. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, Kelvin leaned in, pressing a light peck to Daniel's cheek. It was quick, teasing and almost playful. But it sent a spark through Daniel's entire body. For a moment neither of them moved. Then without thinking Daniel reached out, grabbed the front of Kelvin's shirt and pulled him in. This time he was the one closing the distance, pressing his lips against Kelvin's with a force that surprised even himself. Kelvin responded instantly, his hands settling on Daniel's waist, deepening the kiss. The air around them grew heavy, their breaths mingling as they moved in sync, neither willing to let go. They got intimate with each other for the first time and it felt like a dream. When they finally pulled away, Kelvin's forehead rested against Daniel's, both of them breathless. "I didn't expect you to be this bold," Kelvin said, smiling. Daniel rolled his eyes, trying to mask how fast his heart was racing. "Keep quiet, please." Kelvin chuckled, but there was something softer in his expression now. He brushed a hand through Daniel's hair, his touch lingering. "You know, I think I like this side of you more." Daniel looked down, his fingers still gripping Kelvin's shirt. "I don't know what this is yet," he admitted quietly. Kelvin tilted his head. "Then let's figure it out together." A long silence followed before Daniel sighed, nodding slightly. Maybe he didn't mind the idea of figuring things out with Kelvin and dating secretly. Kelvin grinned, pulling Daniel into another embrace. "Do you think this relationship is worth trying? Please leave a comment below and subscribe to my channel for more stories. Thanks for watching.